Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. In the difficult days during the Azeri blockade of Artsakh, Hovik and I were able to keep in almost daily touch with the conditions in Stepanakert by talking to our friend Gev Iskajyan, who endured the terrible conditions and experienced everything with the people of Artsakh. So as we start closing 2024, Gev Iskajyan is joining us today. But before we jump into that, Hovik, in the past few interviews, we've added over 3,000 new listeners. So welcome to you, everyone. We will continue to bring interesting conversations and weekly reviews of Armenia's political landscape.
And we appreciate your comments and thoughts on our YouTube videos. We thank you for your active participation in our channel's pages because we think you're making a difference and making our channel and videos more visible on YouTube. So please stay involved, like our shows, and share them with your friends. And of course, we would always welcome your support if you would become a sustaining member. Go to podcasts.groong.org/donate and use either Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and a couple of other ways to support us. All right, on with the show.
Hello, Gev. Welcome back. It's been a while.
Good to be on and good to see your faces.
Hey, Gev. Gev, let's start with the blockade. We talked almost every day or two basically during the blockade, which started from December 2022. In the early days, we all thought there'd be some kind of a resolution, perhaps quick, perhaps longer, but everyone, I think, had the fighting spirit in them. But it got worse and worse, and first the gas was shut off, then electricity became limited. The internet got cut off, and it got worse until one day these fake eco-activists, essentially instigated by the Aliyev government and protected by the Azerbaijani military, simply flooded the Berdzor corridor, or the so-called Lachin corridor, and a full blockade was essentially in effect. Those were difficult days, and Armenians worldwide had the sense that we were struggling for the survival of Artsakh. So anyway, it's been tough, I think, mentally preparing to talk to you about this, and that's why I think we've also had a tough time arranging this call. But it's been more than a year now since what happened eventually. Can you give us your impressions and what was going on in your mind at that time?
Yeah, I think let's talk about the last few days, because up until then we were, constantly, as you mentioned, in contact and speaking about these things and, relaying this information to the general public. I think what they didn't get a chance to really hear about were those like final days where it came as, the process of the entire blockade was kind of this slow drip effect where, one day you lose gas, another day electricity, and then all the while the resource scarcity starts to really set in, and day by day there's less and less and less. But when it comes to the last 2 days, I feel like that was a very accelerated moment, because out of nowhere, the Azeris attacked. And unfortunately, when you have an army that is not linked with Armenia's army, it does not have the weaponry to defend itself. And then in terms of positioning, you have Azeris that surround just about every strategic height around these populous areas. So because of that, Azerbaijan was able to, within the course of 48 hours, essentially militarily cut off and enter into Artsakh. And through that, we saw the state collapse before our eyes. We saw the arrest of the political prisoners, and then the mass exodus of over 100,000 people who were ethnically cleansed, essentially a continuation of the genocide against Armenians in that region. The last few days were to be quite frank, I don't know if I can use the words really difficult or tough, because when you're in that moment, you're not thinking about like, okay, how does this affect me? How am I processing and taking this in? There's so many things happening within the course of that like week and a half from when the war started till when everybody departed, that there was work to do, and you can't shut off your mind, and you can't like wallow, because then you can't serve the people that you're there to, work for. So those days were spent there's 1,000,001 needs that arose. So you talk about something like the depopulation of all the rural areas. So Stepanakert, that has a population of 60,000, overnight is now 100,000 people. Where do you shelter those people? Where do they sleep? What do they eat? All of those concerns were things that were on our docket as part of both the officials that were working in the government and then, apparatus like ours or the ARS or some other institutions that occurred. It's how do we meet the needs of all of these people? So it was about finding them housing and food. And then you have situations like the blast at the gas station, which killed over 200 people. That single second where that explosion occurred took almost as many lives as the entirety of that war. And a lot of these people imagine a situation where you've gone through this entire process, you're drained, completely demoralized, and then you go knowing that you're going to be forcibly removed from your homeland, where you've lived, where you fought, and you go there on the last few days, and you not only, for the 200 or so men that gave their lives, not only do they lose their lives, but now all 200 families with the breadwinner, the father, the husband, are now leaving Artsakh, not just without their homeland, but without a staple in their family, and that I think was down the line, when you reflect back on it, that was a very difficult thing to kind of process, of how many families, how many kids are affected in that, single second. And even with that, so many challenges arose, because we hear about the 200 deaths, but we don't hear about is like nearly 750 people were injured from that blast. And so almost, you're talking about, you have all of these soldiers that are coming in. You already have hospitals that only have like 4 or 5 doctors at the time anyways. So they're dealing with dozens of soldiers, hundreds of whom are wounded. And then they're dealing with all of these people from that fire explosion. Either one of those scenarios would have been way above the capacity of Artsakh's healthcare system. Both of them combined within a week was very, very difficult in terms of medicine, care, getting people airlifted. So those days, I don't know if there was a moment to reflect, to like process, okay, what's happening? Because processing is a reflective process, and it's time consuming. And in those days, you don't have time. It's about meeting the needs of your people.
Have you had a chance to talk to people since then and reflect? I mean,
Yeah.
there is this narrative being spread now that, they suddenly just
packed up and left.
packed up and left. I know, for instance, obviously that's not the case. And
Yeah.
did Armenians really have any other options? And what were the conditions under which they left?
I don't think Armenians had any other options, because you would have to be able to point to one successful Armenian community within Azerbaijan to be able to say that Armenians have options. And the anywhere else that we've looked, if we want to go back 30 years to Baku and Sumgait, or if we want to go back 4 years to Shushi and Hadrut, where the people that were left behind were literally beheaded on video, there's never been a single instance where Armenians have been safe under the auspice of the Azerbaijani regime. At any given time, I would say, outside of kind of the Soviet Union, but you can even go back to like the 1920s, you can go back to the early 1990s, you can go back to 2020. So this notion that like, oh, why didn't you guys just give it a try, blah, blah. There was plenty of Armenians throughout the last 100 years that tried to give that a try. They were either ethnically cleansed or butchered. So that's not on anybody to take on. And no one's fought harder than the people of Artsakh. That's one notion that we have to like keep in mind. Can people say like, we should have done something differently, we should have waited till this moment, or we should have strategically, militarily done this or that thing? Sure, we can all like, reflect back and say, maybe if we did this instead of that. But when people who have never had skin in the game are critiquing the Artsakhs, who have been the frontline defense for Armenia, who fought wars in the 90s, who fought wars in 2016, who fought wars in 2020, who fought wars in 2023. Like, nobody has been more willing to fight for the Armenian nation, for the survival of their homeland. So I don't pay attention to those folks. And then to those folks in Armenia that may make those statements, I would ask, are you upset that we didn't fight enough? And if the answer is yes, then I say, okay, you have the right to be that upset. Are you upset that the Armenian government didn't fight at all, didn't try? Are you upset that 2 million people in the homeland did, or do you reserve your selective outrage for the people that you want to scapegoat? Like, it's a very simple logical deduction to see the veil of like anti-Artsakh sentiment. It's not rooted in any like sensible logic.
My question was not actually about those who protect the government in Armenia and who are Armenian. It's about the narrative that is being spun by the spin doctors under Aliyev, and potentially international observers, analysts who might actually buy that.
Well, he's having a tough time, Hovik, selling that, because Freedom House came out with a report saying that it was ethnic cleansing. Human Rights Watch came out with a report that it was ethnic cleansing. So the people that buy that narrative are people who are selling themselves. There's nobody that has bought that narrative through like objectively looking at the scenario. Sure, there'll be people that come out and say that, oh, the Armenians could have lived under this or that. But I guarantee you there's a trail to where they're being either sponsored by or funded by Azerbaijani narratives and, power.
Gev, we're talking about the Azerbaijani government. What about the Armenian government? I know that you said that during the days when all these events were precipitating, it was difficult to think about the macro picture. Everybody's trying to survive. Everybody's trying to do whatever they need to do to get on with life. But what was the population's posture towards the Pashinyan government, which had completely abandoned their cause?
And just to remind everyone, as soon as the fighting started, we were hoping, okay, well, I mean, we have to do something, right? Armenians.
Yeah.
And the Armenian government simply said, Artsakh.
Yeah.
So they officially declared that they would not fight.
Yeah. I think that what was their stance towards Pashinyan? It's difficult to encapsulate that because their stance towards Pashinyan was already like the prism that they would view him through was always through a negative light, because you're not just talking about the blockade or pulling the troops out of Armenia or doing nothing during the last war. It's about also 2020 and the deals he signed. It's also about like every sentiment that he's uttered towards Artsakhs. It's also about Ana Hagopian flaunting, going shopping and cooking while there's 100,000 Armenians that are like
starving.
Yeah. So it wasn't that once the ethnic cleansing happened, then people were like, oh, now Pashinyan is bad. It's like saying are you ever disappointed in the devil? You're never really disappointed in the devil because you know what to expect from him, right? You can have an array of emotions, but disappointment isn't one when you know exactly who is in front of you. And I think that's the case with Pashinyan, and I think that extends beyond Artsakh too. I think there's what Pashinyan has done so well is demoralize the Armenian public and make them think that this is our natural state, that somehow we deserve to be living like
a victim state.
Right? Yes, and he continues and he feeds that to them. When he got elected, he was getting up on stages and saying Artsakh is Armenia and no one can move an inch towards us, blah blah. Today he goes out and says that Turkey's saying that maybe we should rewrite our constitution. Azerbaijan thinks so too. I think we should do it. Why should we upset them? So you go from this very proud, and I think this extends beyond politics. A lot of time that I've spent this year has been trying to address you look at Pashinyan. whether you're on my side of the political fence or another, it doesn't matter. Pashinyan is like a failed state, a failed candidate in just about any objection. Like you have like folks that are associated with my party, the ARF, that hate him and think that he's a failure. You have folks that are associated with Levonte Bedrossian that think he's
the same thing.
Failure. Exactly. So for whichever like view that you look at him through, you know that he's failed, and that makes me ask like, why do we tolerate this? And how many nations on earth would tolerate this? And I don't think we've been looking for answers, and those answers have always been like political. Like, can we get the right guy? Can we like bring in someone new? I think it extends beyond that. Like politics is downstream from culture. What we need is a cultural understanding of identity, of who we are, about the fact that these existential threats that we've been talking about, they are not the fear-mongering of nationalists. They are a reality that Armenians face. And how do we reorient ourselves through that prism? I'm more interested in the larger questions, this notion that menk hayենք ու հպարտ and no matter what happens, we'll find a way. I don't buy that. I'm of the mindset that there have been 2,500 nations that have come up throughout the like age of civilization. Today, only 200 of them exist. And by some miracle and luck, we happen to be one of them. However, we are always in a precarious situation, and we always need to be vigilant, alert about keeping our identity and our statehood. I think we forgot that. I think we felt comfortable. We thought that this land is going to forever exist, that it doesn't need to be upheld, that we can pursue these like whatever foreign dreams, whether it's we look towards the West or towards the East, it doesn't matter, but not being rooted on the ground. And we need to have a cultural awakening of understanding what it means to be Armenian and keep being Armenian, generation after generation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the foreverness of the land and everything being so easy. I mean, look at much larger nations right now, Ukraine, stuff on the brink of destruction. So survival is not an easy thing.
I know we have a lot of new subscribers, perhaps through some of our a few popular episodes that we had recently. So many are not aware of the Armenian politics, which is what we try to do weekly. But I think a naive question would be why, in that case, is Pashinyan still in power? And I have, we always ask that question, and I'm not sure if it's enough to say that we can justify it by saying there are certain interests, powerful interests, that are interested in keeping Pashinyan in power. Just look at what happened to the Georgian government when it simply said, maybe I don't want to be with the EU 100%. I still have this huge neighbor on my side. And all of a sudden they're anti-democratic. Meanwhile, none of the foreign embassies dare to criticize Pashinyan. In fact, they criticize the protesters whenever there's a protest. And we had 3 huge movements since then. I know this is sort of like tangential to the question of Artsakh, but I'm sure that we'll get those in the comments. Like, why is Pashinyan still in power? Is it sufficient to justify it by saying, there are these powerful outside interests that we simply seem to be powerless against?
I think that Pashinyan is backed by an apparatus that doesn't. I don't think that they've bet on Pashinyan, but they've bet on someone like Pashinyan. So tomorrow, if Pashinyan goes and Alan Simonian stays, I think those same forces will be just as happy. So it's important to view it from that lens as well. The West views us as an object of interest because they want to turn us away from Russia. But after we turn away from Russia, they don't really care what happens to us. And I don't mean that in like this like reductive sense. Like there's like historical precedent for that. How many times has the US cared about Afghanistan and then not cared and then cared and then not cared, and then in that process fed the population to the Taliban or got them to fight against the Soviet Union, or you know what I'm saying? Like the attention of the US or the West waxes and wanes, and we have to be very like cognizant of that. Currently, they have interest there because of Iran, because of Russia, and they want to turn us against those forces. But turning us against those forces, the only other way that you survive with the nations that are next to you is turning you towards the wolves, which is the Turks and the Azeris. Now, normalization under certain like preconditions, great. There's mutual respect, understanding of history, blah, 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 whatever. That's all fine and dandy. Normalization under this guise of like fake peace is very, very dangerous about making Armenia economically reliant on Turkey and Azerbaijan. And that economic reliance they can then use against you, cutting off your corridors, cutting off your access routes to places like Iran. Like there's so many things that come into play here. So these nations view us through that lens, and whoever gets them towards that goal, they will toss Pashinyan out if they can find somebody else that's more competent, but will do the same things, competent for them, that will do the same things. I think, why is Pashinyan in power? I think it's amalgamation of a few things. One is that like we need to have a reality check as an Armenian nation. Our level of political understanding needs to rise. And I'm not saying it in comparison to another nation, or are we more politically educated than the average country, blah, blah, blah. To be honest, I don't know, but we are not politically educated enough to make the right decisions. And that's
we're working on that, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. But my fear sometimes is the people listening to this show are people who care about the future of the Armenian nation and are interested. And you've already got them, you know, through one means or another. Who are the folks that are cynical, are apathetic, are disillusioned? Who are the people that convey these like conspiracy theories and blah, blah, blah? Like these are the masses that we have to reach. And I'm not one that's like, it's not all the fault of the politicians. That is not a fair assessment to make, to say like, oh, well, the opposition hasn't done enough, or that Pashinyan has all these resources. Like at some time, in some level, we have to look at ourselves as a general populace and say, okay, what are we doing wrong as well? Like we can blame people, we can have president after president come, we can blame our woes on corruption, on the Soros Agans, on these, on that. This is our nation. How do we hold people accountable in our nation? How do we make everyone educated enough to hold people accountable? Like we are, in some senses, like you get the government that maybe you don't deserve, but like there's some justification for the government that you get, right? And that is the question that we need to start like asking ourselves. And this has to bleed throughout society. It cannot stay in these niche groups of people that like think about these issues already. The artists, the athletes, the influencers, like this has to culturally like be some type of renaissance to where we understand what it takes to keep the Armenian nation. Until we get there, I'm very tired of doing the political, like, you know, if we get this candidate to run against Pashinyan and then we can build a coalition with these guys, blah, blah. Like, I'm over that game. What is sick is at the core of our culture. And there's so many things I love and adore about our culture, but there are certain things that we have to like, understand that we're not doing the right way. And I was speaking yesterday to a friend about this. Our pride as a nation has been the reason why we've been able to come up against like enormous odds and win. There's this delusional confidence that comes from being Armenian, like that Najde Agan mentality, that like that is not a logical, like, you know, frame to think from, but that's helped us. However, in times where things have seemed mellow, it is that same pride that has killed us. This notion of like, oh, who are the Azeris? Who are the Turks? When they come, we'll be ready, blah, blah, blah. So that same pride that helps you when you're against insurmountable odds really works against your detriment when you forget where you are and where you're placed. And we have to address that as a nation.
Yeah, I want to go back to what we were talking a little bit before. It seems that one of Azerbaijan's key demands to stop the fighting and the safe exodus of the Armenian population, or relatively safe, because we know that tens of people died on that route,
Yeah.
was the surrender of key military political leadership of Artsakh,
Yeah.
including Bako Sahakyan, Narkazi Ghukasyan, David Babayan, Ruben Vartanyan, Arshavir Gharamanyan, David Ishkhanyan. I'm sure I'm forgetting many more, but they were taken in Azerbaijani custody and are now going through sham trials, facing life imprisonment.
Mhm.
What can you tell us about those last moments? Was their surrender the price for the Armenians to leave Artsakh?
Um, because of their arrest and because of the way that it was set up, there were so many more people that could have been detained that weren't. And there is no other prism that I look at these people through than one of selflessness and heroism as well. These aren't just people that were part of the core leadership of today. They are people that for the last 30 years, against all odds, helped build this nation and were dedicated to it until their last moments, selflessly gave themselves up, understanding full well what awaits them in Azerbaijan for the love of their people. And this works out well for the Armenian government because none of them exemplify any of those ideals. And having politicians with that type of mindset and that reputation and that type of character would hurt them deeply. So they're not going to try and release our captives. If today 100 Azerbaijani soldiers fell into the hands of the Armenian army by any sheer stroke of luck as political prisoners, there would not be a swap. We would give all 100 back and we would tell them to keep our political prisoners in Baku. Like that is the mentality that Armenia operates with, which is why it's incredibly important for us in the diaspora to leverage what we can to raise the voice of these people. And this is where the diaspora also comes in handy. Like I am big on there is no identity, culture, whatever it is, whatever it means to be Armenian without an Armenia. Eventually, all of that will dissipate if you do not keep your home. However, at the same time, a strong diaspora is very important. And moments like this, when you have a government in Armenia that is playing buddy with the Azeris, and then you have diasporas like here in the United States or in France that like when COP29 happens, the climate conference in Baku, the Armenian government congratulates them. We work here on making sure that our representatives are boycotting it, are speaking truth to power, are using that as a platform. So like doing a lot of the work that the Armenian government should be doing for the Armenian nation, that's where we come in handy. And on this issue of our political prisoners, no one's going to think about them if we don't. And beyond those 12 people, getting these folks released and fighting and advocating for them is incredibly important because the leadership of Azerbaijan is trying to jail these Artsakh leaders to kill the Armenian and Artsakh spirit. That is part of it. They know that these people represent the idea of independence, the idea of an Artsakh, and they want that to die as well. It's not just about locking these people up. It's trying to tell them this dream of an independent state, it's over. Your leaders are behind bars and like your hopes are caged. Right. And it's about fighting against that narrative, too, every time that we're fighting it for these people.
Gev, another group that was a player in the final days of the Artsakh events were the Russian Peacekeepers. So, of course, we know that they got installed after the war in 2020. And after Pashinyan went to Prague in October 2022 and gave Artsakh to Aliyev, basically, the Russians started putting out the narrative that there was nothing they could do. Frankly, my view was that they had the responsibility to keep Artsakh safe, and they failed in that. What was the view of the Russian peacekeepers? How did it evolve from, let's say, the days of the blockade, or even before the blockade, to the blockade, and to the final days of the ethnic cleansing?
I don't want to speak for you. Have 100,000 people, 100,000 perspectives. So I don't want to speak for them. I'll speak from my lens of what I was thinking at that time in regards to the Russian peacekeeping contingency. So there's two sides of it. One is I remember having a conversation with somebody in like the military command on the Russian side, and essentially saying that like, what are you guys doing? Like, this was like the day that the attack started. Like, you had one job, and it was the safekeeping, and then it was the peacekeeping of this region and of these people's lives. And so many of them moved back to Artsakh with that promise in mind.
Right. That's right.
And the response on their end is 4 months ago, the president of your country just declared that this place that we're supposed to peacekeep belongs to Azerbaijan. He verbatim stated it, and he's been going capital stating it. He is unwilling to have any of his soldiers die for this land to protect it. Now, as Russians, they from their perspective, they're saying, your president doesn't recognize this land as yours. Internationally says, in fact, it's Azerbaijan's. And two, he's not willing to expand a single, not just lives, but a single bullet for it. And we are supposed to do that for you guys. So that's a very difficult thing to respond to. That is not an easy response. However, on the other hand, the Russian peacekeepers gave their word not to the people in Yerevan or the politicians in the National Assembly. They gave their word to the people of Artsakh, and they failed on. So many people that were, had to flee during 2020, the women and the children and those families while the war was going on. Most logical folks won't sign up part 2 for that, but they did, right? So much of that population came back and tried to resettle and reroute their lives. And all of that, again, resulted in ethnic cleansing, this time for much, I don't want to use the word permanently, but this time for a much longer course of time, right? So they not only failed in that regard, I also don't think it's like smart foreign policy for the Russians. The war in Ukraine really, I know they're playing this like war of attrition there, hoping that they can bleed out the Ukrainians. But at the same time, their geopolitical interests everywhere else, maybe their backyard, they're keen in and locked on, but their geopolitical interest everywhere else has been waning and fading.
They've suffered.
Look at Artsakh last year. You look at Syria a couple of weeks ago, and this is because their resources are so outstretched because of that war. And the Russian leadership is eventually going to have to come, and if there is no deal soon, maybe there might be one with this Trump administration. But if there isn't one soon, the leadership of Russia is going to have to sit down and say, like, okay, we focused on Ukraine and we lost assets everywhere else throughout the world. Maybe we need to reposition our thinking.
You talked about the Trump administration. That was our next and final topic.
Yeah.
The 44-day war, of course, happened in the waning days of the Trump presidency. He lost that election during the war and did nothing to stop it. In fact, we think that the U.S. deep state was probably complicit or maybe turning a blind eye to the Turkish-Azeri planning of the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. So in January, Trump returns to the White House. What should be the Armenian American priorities in the coming 4 years? What are our top advocacy priorities, Gev?
I think in terms of priorities, Artsakh at the top of that list. And solely because what our enemies and what our adversaries want is for the idea of Artsakh to die out. The notion that we can have an independent land, that we can return to our homes, blah, blah, blah. They will be doing everything they can in the next few years to, yes, like develop that land, bulldoze homes, whatever, but also to kill the Armenian psyche. Why would they be so hell-bent on changing the constitution if that's the one thing that's preventing them from like signing this like so-called peace deal, if they're not scared that the idea of Artsakh lives on? So as advocacy putting that on the forefront. And you had Kamala Harris, who look, both of them have failed us when they were supposed to come through. The Biden-Harris administration during the ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, the Trump administration during 2020. So there's, I'm not saying this from a perspective of giving them credit, but about elevating the issue on the national platform. You have Kamala Harris, who's running as the Democratic presidential candidate, coming out and saying that Artsakhi's have the right to return, verbatim. We fought for that. To have one of the maybe one or two most powerful people, to have the two people vying to be the most powerful person on earth, to utter those statements is a win for us. It's about elevating that issue. Then you have Trump talking about the persecution of Christians and minorities and that he's going to support it. Like, the elevation of Artsakh on a national stage takes work. This does not just happen. There, people say like, oh, they're just catering to this populace or that populace. Yeah, but they also have Azeri lobbyists and Turkish interests and lobbyists, and they are against those interests speaking out for Artsakh. So that is a win for us. However, do words mean much? No, it's all about action. And I would view what we do and the lens that we frame Trump in as the lens that we would frame any president under, which is objective and accountable to Armenian interests. So there are some points of hope, and this is, we expanded a lot of effort and energy into this, but throughout the electoral process, we wanted to elevate people that were elevating the Artsakh issue. That was our goal. Whether they're Republican, Democrat, Independent, didn't matter. So people like Bobby Kennedy, RFK, people like Tulsi Gabbard, people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a nominee to be president, who kept talking about these issues and then in turn exposing Artsakh to millions of people throughout the United States. Every chance that we could, we built relationships and elevated them. And we did it knowing that if there's a Republican administration, just like we work with our colleagues on the Democratic side, there's a Republican administration and these people are in it, it will be, let me use the words correctly, because political forecasting is not a smart thing to do. So it was good positioning for them to be in those roles. So today you have Tulsi Gabbard, who, if she gets confirmed, will be the director of national intelligence. So she oversees the CIA, the NSA, all these institutions. This is someone that's one of the handful of Congress members that has actually been to Artsakh, has stepped foot on that ground, knowing that she would be banned from Azerbaijan, knowing that it is a harshness. She now will be overseeing the security apparatus
all of intelligence
of the United States. That is not a joke. That is good positioning. You have Vivek, who is one of Trump's most trusted confidants and going to be a star in that party for decades to come. Now part of his cabinet. You have RFK, who did like an interview with like Zartong and came to our galas. I think I might have even seen him at like a Hominid Men basketball game. Like, he's like a part of the community, part of the cabinet on Trump's side. And to be honest, if Kamala were to get elected, we would see like who is in her inner circle that has connections to Armenians that we can help elevate. You know, it's not a partisan view. I look at both candidates through the prism of Armenian interests, solely because it is my job, solely because to do this professionally, I have to put aside whatever other views I have, because no one else is going to fight for us like that. We have some responsibility at a certain level to think like a state. We do. I'm talking about the ANCAS. How would we act in the framing of our interests? So all we can do is position ourselves, and I think we've positioned ourselves as best as possible in regards to this election. That doesn't mean Trump's going to deliver. That doesn't mean the deep state won't win out. Maybe a lot of them get fired and all of that gets like restructured. Maybe it doesn't. But we know that we are in a better position today than we were 6 months ago, than we were a year ago. And that is what we fight to do. We fight every day to give ourselves a little better chance. and we will keep them accountable. We have no horse in this bet. If Trump does not come through on the things that he said he's going to do, he will get another F grade, and he will continue not to get an endorsement. And if he comes through for the Armenian people, we will encourage good behavior.
All right. We're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, Gev, for joining us. This has been a very good talk.
Good to be
Thank you,
back
Gev.
on.
All right. That's our show today. And this was recorded on December 17, 2024. We've been talking with Gev Iskajyan, who was the ANC representative in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, and lived there throughout the Artsakh blockade at the end of 2022 and 2023. For more information on the participants in this episode, check out our show notes at podcast.groong.org/episode number. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And I'm Hovik Manucharyan.
Please find us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. Thanks a lot. We'll put every link in the show notes.
Talk to you soon.